Hello, my friend. My name is Colby Bloom, and this is Painting the Wilderness Seascapes. It's a 10-day watercolor painting challenge where we are going to explore one of the most captivating and intimidating subjects there is to paint: moving water. Over the next 10 days, we are going to paint one tutorial at a time, oceans and lakes and moving water that captures sunlight and color. And it is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to make a whole lot of messes, and I'm gonna give you some of my best mindset tips along the way, so that even if it's scary, even if it's frustrating, even when your paintings don't look like my paintings, you can still find so much joy and wonder and discovery from this journey, and hopefully learn some fun watercolor tips and tricks along the way to make painting seascapes really enjoyable for you in the future. Today is day 1, and we are going to explore a sparkling ocean scene where, with just a few colors and lots of patient layers, we're going to slowly build up light reflecting on the ocean surface. Now, this might sound like a very intimidating choice for day 1, but I promise it was intentional. So we're slowly going to build contrast, and we're going to build, colors and movement through painting one layer at a time using fairly basic techniques. It might take some patience, and that's okay. It will take some courage, and that's okay. I'm gonna be here with you the whole time. So let's get started. Let's dive right in. This is day 1. We're going to paint glimmering sunlight on top of ocean waves. So the point of this project really is to demonstrate that complex subjects like light dancing on top of ocean waves can be broken down into step-by-step pieces. And with watercolor, the way that you do that is by breaking them down into individual layers. So just keep that in mind as we get going. We're really only using 4 paint colors here. I'm using Payne's Gray, Winsor & Newton Payne's Gray. I'm using yellow ochre. I'm also using a little bit of lemon yellow deep, although that's not necessary really. And then I'm using white gouache just at the very end. So, keep that in mind as we are kind of gathering supplies here. And as you can see, I am using an Etcher brand watercolor journal. So this is an Etcher watercolor journal, 100% cotton paper. And I am taping the sides of the journal with extra long pieces of tape so that they can kind of wrap around the edge of the journal and keep my paper taut. And I'm using Holbein soft tape. So all of the supplies are linked in the description below. So if you want to check them out, you can definitely check them out. If you would like to sign up for the email list and you haven't already, then I provide you a handy dandy, supplies PDF with links there also. So that's the link to sign up for the email list where you can get these tutorials sent directly to your inbox every day. That's also in the description below. All right, so I'm showing this to you in real time. In the next few days, I will probably speed the taping up a little bit. But one thing as you're watching me tape, note that I'm using extra long tape, like I said, so I can wrap around the journal. The order went top, bottom, and then side to side. And doing it that way, top, bottom, and then side to side, in terms of laying down the tape, will just ensure that the tape doesn't stick to each other. The pieces of tape don't stick to each other. Okay, and then I put some binder clips on the side, but that's not super necessary. Sometimes I do that, sometimes I don't. So the first layer for this glimmering waves scene. First, I get my whole paper wet, and it's important to note that we're separating this scene into thirds. So the top third is going to be the sky, and the bottom 2/3 is going to be the ocean, okay? So first, I'm on my wet paper, I'm taking some yellow ochre, and I am painting it along the horizon, so along that bottom third, leaving a space that's kind of white in the middle. That's where the sun is going to be, okay? And then kind of just painting it on the sides. And then after I finished painting some of that, placing that yellow like on the sides and along the bottom of that top third, then I went side to side and put some of that yellow ochre down in the ocean area too. This is just layer 1. So we're going to do a few different layers as we do this. And I want to make sure that I'm keeping that center mostly clear, although it is kind of fun to just kind of lightly brush a little bit of color into it, knowing that that centerpiece is going to be the sun, right? Where it's brightest, that's where we need to keep it the most white. But I am just kind of playing around loosely with a little bit of color because sometimes some color, kind of stripes across suns. And anyway, so that's just kind of what's happening there. And now I am adding on some, I mixed a little bit of lemon yellow deep with the yellow ochre, and just to make it a little bit more bright in the sky. And then I let it dry all the way. So at this point, my very first layer was this yellow ochre, right? And the yellow ochre made up the horizon. It made up kind of the sides and the top. So it kind of put the sun in a little, I don't want to say box, but that's kind of what it is. And then it made up some of the waves that I made going side to side all the way down the middle of the ocean. Okay, so I let it dry. I used a little dryer, and then I re-wet completely with water. And now I'm taking some very light value Payne's gray, meaning watery. Light value means some watery Payne's gray, and painting it just along the top, and then just a little bit into the yellow ochre area. We want to be careful here because if we mix the yellow ochre too much with the Payne's gray, it might turn kind of like a brownish green. So I rinsed off my brush a lot, and then I also took some kind of pigmented, meaning not super watery, but has a lot of paint, yellow ochre, and made some stripes just up in the sky there. So after that, I let it dry. My sky is pretty much done, right? I have the light kind of glimmering in the sky. So I let it dry, and then I re-wet. And now I'm just adding some Payne's gray on the side of the waves that we've painted in yellow ochre. So this process is going to be a lot of sometimes painting with very watery Payne's gray and sometimes painting with water to push away some of the paint so that we have this very light blue, and then we can still see the yellow ochre waves right down the middle. And as you can see, I let it dry. So the bottom part that I was just painting, I let it dry, and it looks fairly light, and that's good. That's what we want. Because one thing about watercolor is that you want to start lighter than you think, because it's easier to make something darker. It is harder to make it lighter. So the next step that we're going to do is we're kind of painting in the darker part of the ocean, right? So I started with the horizon up there, and I got my whole paper wet, and then I added a little bit of Payne's gray along the top of the horizon. And I made sure that the middle space directly underneath the sun, there was not very much Payne's gray there. Now, if you find as you're working, this is wet paper, right? So if you find as you're working on wet paper that it's really hard to keep the Payne's gray away from the middle of the sun, that's where you want to use a wet brush just with water and push away the paint. So the whole rest of this layer and the next layers that we're going to do on top of this, because there are still more to come, the whole rest of this layer is basically going back and forth between adding yellow and adding Payne's gray, and then keeping some of the spaces between yellow and Payne's gray lighter, because we want that contrast. We want that subtle, and this is still wet on wet, right? So this whole layer is still wet on wet. We want that contrast to be a subtle blend between, the light of the paper, the yellow of the sunlight there, and then on the sides is where it's darker with the Payne's gray. So I'm gonna keep working at some point. Honestly, that whole layer probably took me more like 20 minutes. I sped it up to, to show you how to do it. But it took me a little bit of working it there. And then I let it dry completely. Here's the scary part. Here's the scary part that really scares a lot of people. And even if you're a beginner, I want you to know that you can do this. Practicing this right now you're only going to get more comfortable, and you kind of just have to bite the bullet. The scary part is the wet on dry layers, okay? So up to this point, we've been doing wet on wet, meaning painting with paint on wet paper so that it's kind of blended and we can kind of move it around and shape it as we want. Now we're adding wet on dry to add contrast, and I'm doing it in kind of these, the Payne's gray is pretty light value, meaning still kind of watery, and I'm making these very rudimentary wave shapes, right? Sometimes I'm doing just kind of horizontal lines. Sometimes I'm actually making the shape of a wave, and I'm just kind of in broken strokes, really, because I want to keep the light parts of the paper. I still want to preserve some of the light parts of the paper, right? I'm using very watery paint and broken strokes to create some contrast here, to create some of those wave-like things. And when you first paint on it, you're gonna be like, I ruined it. This looks terrible. You didn't. You didn't ruin it. And you just kind of have to keep going. More waves on top of each other. And we're starting with I started with a size 6 brush, so I did kind of larger waves. But then the more I'm going, after that first layer, you can see I still have kept the middle yellow waves, which is exactly what I wanted. But now I'm using a smaller brush with slightly darker paint. So the whole process of adding waves here is that we're starting with light paint and a kind of big brush, and our whole goal is to, add movement to the scene while keeping the yellow and the white parts still there, while still preserving some of the yellow and light parts. Then, as I'm continuing painting with my small brush, the darker the paint, I'm gonna slowly make my paint darker, all the while preserving all of the lighter parts I had previously painted, okay? And I'm going to make my strokes a little smaller. So the smaller I get, the darker I get, the less paint that I need. All right, so at this point, we started very, very light, and then we slowly get darker and smaller. And the shape of the waves are mostly the same. I'm going back and forth between just doing random horizontal stripes and between making wave shapes. And it might look like I know exactly where I'm painting, but I don't. I don't know exactly where I'm painting. All I know is that I want to keep glimmers of the sun, right? And so I know I'm covering up a lot of the sun waves that we created, and that's okay, because really the point of painting with this small paintbrush is that I can make tinier strokes so that the glimmers in the waves look like actual sparkles, as opposed to giant waves of yellow. And so by starting small, by starting big and light and then gradually growing darker and smaller, I can get more detailed the longer I go. So that whole process, me adding those wet on dry waves, that whole process probably took me about half an hour, just for the record. And it didn't go I sped it up a lot, obviously. And sometimes it was me going slow and trying to pay attention to where I was going, but mostly I was just I just have to get used to making uncertain marks. And that's exactly what this project is for. Get used to making uncertain marks. So now I'm using white gouache, and this is optional. So at this point, you could be done. But I'm using white gouache right now in order to add sparkles on top of the waves. And when you think about adding sparkles or wave shapes generally, remember zigzags, okay? We're trying to paint this kind of zigzag wave formation. And I laid down a little bit of gouache first. It wasn't quite as thick or opaque as I wanted, so I got a little bit more. So I'm using it in its paste form, and I'm just painting little dots. And not very many. These sparkles are just highlights. They're just an added detail. I'm painting little dots with lots of paint in kind of a loose zigzag formation. And now I'm gonna wipe off my brush, and I'm gonna pick up some paint. So my brush is mostly dry. I'm gonna pick up some paint and brush the dry brush technique in vertical motion, so up and down, and this is what makes the paint sparkle. So again, I'm using kind of a dry brush, tapping it into the paste gouache, and then just gently painting right on top of those sparkles. So, and that's the whole scene. That's it. All we did was start very light. We started with very, very light paint, and we slowly added layers and layers and layers on top of it. Your project is probably not going to look like mine, especially if you are a beginner. Your project is probably going to look a little bit messy. Mine looks messy. I know that it looks like, oh wow. I mean, I don't know what it looks like for you, but I look at it and I remember the whole big mess that happened as I was making it. And I just want to tell you that I started with this project. I know it looks intimidating, but I started with this project as day one on purpose, because in order to get comfortable painting water, you have to get comfortable painting a mess. You have to get comfortable adding lots of layers and just trusting that the more you keep the key concepts in mind that we talked about, right? We start light and then we gradually get darker. We start with kind of big waves and then we gradually get smaller. And we start with the wet on wet technique and gradually add in wet on dry details. The more you can keep those things in mind, the more confidence you'll have in painting projects just like this. So now that we've kind of finished the whole project, I'm going to transition into a really important part of this process, which is looking at what you've done and kind of analyzing your process, right? If you took my previous Painting the Wilderness challenge, you know that I love to think about two things after I paint a project, specifically a project that I'm painting to learn something, right? I like to think about three things that I loved, and I like to think about three things that I learned. And so for day one of this Painting the Wilderness seascapes, we painted this sparkling wave scene, and man, it looks very complicated, and you might have made a giant mess, and that is okay. Because I do want to tell you one thing before I kind of just break down the things that I loved and learned. Watercolor is not about painting pretty pictures. It feels nice to paint pretty pictures, but art and creativity, it is so much more about exercising your courage, about practicing your courage and knowing that regardless of whether your painting is a mess or a masterpiece, it was a valuable use of your time. And you are fully capable of feeling joy in this moment. And that's what this whole loved versus learned thing is about, right? So we think about three things that we loved. I loved the contrast of the soft sky with the dark sea that has the wet on dry details on it. I also really, really loved the patient layers that it took to build up the ocean. Like I said, in total, the ocean took me the most of this process. And the natural movement of the light in the water, I really loved how I was able to get that with like the zigzag motion and just, you know, as I was carefully adding smaller strokes, preserving those light spaces. So things that I learned, zigzag and imperfect strokes are my friends, right? I need to lean into being more comfortable being imperfect. Sparkles look better with a little bit of dry brush on top of it in that vertical stroke. And then I did think about maybe I want to preserve more white space. I would bet if I were you, like especially if you're a beginner, I would bet that preserving more white space is something that maybe you can work on. And it's okay if you didn't do it perfectly the first time. It's all good. And I'm so proud of you, and I can't wait until we work on day two.